we're going to continue with the 12th chapter of The Curse of the Blue Figurine by John Bellairs. Johnny and the professor appear to have defeated the ghost of Father Bart. They have come out of the mountains 2 days early, have yet to tell Johnny's grandparents what happened, but they are planning on it. Johnny has been sworn to secrecy, though, until the professor is ready to tell. 3 days passed. During this time, Johnny stayed at home. He did jigsaw puzzles and played cribbage and checkers with Grandpa. Meanwhile, across the street, the professor was busy. First, he called up Dr. Melkonian and chewed him out. Without giving the doctor a chance to get a word in edgewise, he told him that he was a pompous, posturing, bearded hornswoggler who ought to have his psychiatric license revoked. He accused him of mystagogic muckification and pointless prattle, and said that he'd ask for his money back if he thought there was any chance it'd be returned. He ended up by slamming the receiver down hard in the doctor's ear. This little rant did not make a whole lot of sense, but it left the professor feeling relieved and curiously satisfied. Next, the professor hired a cleaning lady to whip his house into shape so he could have visitors in. Finally, he made a long-distance call to an old friend of his up in Durham, New Hampshire, the town where the University of New Hampshire is. On a Friday night at around 8 o'clock, Grandma, Grandpa, and Johnny went across the street to the professor's house. When he met them at the door, he was wearing a red damask smoking jacket that smelled of mothballs, and he was smoking Balkan Sobrane tobacco in a pipe. He had decided that cigarettes were bad for his health. The professor ushered his guests into the living room. The bright fire burned in the fireplace, and the crystal pendants on the ormolu candlesticks in the mantel glistened and glittered. In an easy chair by the fire, someone was sitting, a stranger. He was a tall, weedy man, with a fluff of white hair on his head. He wore big, goggly, horn-rimmed glasses, and his long, pointed nose was bent and ridged. The shoulders of his tweed jacket were covered with dandruff, and the elbows had leather patches. His pants were baggy and shapeless, and his long, pointed shoes looked as if they were made out of cardboard. "This is Professor Charles Coote," said Professor Childermass, pointing toward the man. "He is an old friend of mine, and he has written a very important book on Egyptian magic. He also knows a great deal about Ushabti, of which we shall have more to say later." Professor Coote stood up and made 3 quick nods of his head, one toward Johnny, one toward Grandma, and one toward Grandpa. Then he sat down and folded his hands in his lap. Professor Childermass led Grandma and Grandpa over to the sofa and asked them to sit down. Johnny sat down on a straight chair and squirmed impatiently. He did not know what the professor was going to say or do, and he was impatient and extremely curious. The professor took his pipe out of his mouth and harumphed. He looked around as if he didn't know where he was, and then, with a sudden abrupt dash, he went to the sideboard and came back with a rattling tray full of bottles and glasses. He set the tray down on the coffee table with a jolt, and then he backed away into the middle of the room. Entertaining people was a chore for the professor. He didn't do it often, and whenever he did it, he acted as if he was trying to get things over with as quickly as possible. "Well, just help yourselves," he said, waving his hand awkwardly. "There. Well, there's sherry for those who drink it, an imitation non-alcoholic sherry-flavored punch for those who like that sort of thing. Just help yourselves." When this little speech was over, the professor retreated to the fireplace and stood there, fidgeting. Professor Coote got up and loped across the room to the coffee table. He poured himself a glass of sherry and went back to his chair. Then everyone else started to help themselves. Johnny wanted a glass of sherry, but he could tell from the look in Grandma's eye that he'd better have some of the other stuff instead. When everybody had something to drink, the professor poured himself a glass of sherry. He downed it all in one gulp, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and slammed the glass down on the mantelpiece. After some harumphing and nose-blowing, he turned again to face his company and began to speak. He had called them here, he said, to clear up some of the mysteries of the last few months. First, he wanted Johnny to speak. "Who, me, Professor?" Johnny asked, tapping his chest with his finger. The professor nodded. "Yes, you, my friend. I want you to begin at the beginning and tell these folks everything you can remember about the whole crazy business that you've been mixed up in." Johnny thought about the figurine he had stolen from the church. He glanced nervously at Grandma and Grandpa. "Do I have to tell everything?" he asked. "Yes," said the professor firmly. "Everything. Don't leave out a jot or a tittle or a smidgen. And don't worry, no one's going to disown you or clap you in irons. Please begin." Johnny told his tale. He told about how he had stolen the figurine from the church. He told about Mr. Beard and the ring, and the weird and ghostly things that had happened to him after he put the ring on his finger and began saying the prayer to Thoth and Taurus. Finally, he told about what had happened to him and the professor up on Hellbent Mountain at midnight, and amid lightning and thunder and rain. Of course, since Johnny had been unconscious or sleepwalking during part of this last episode, the professor had to fill in details. He did this in a very dramatic way with lots of gestures. Finally, when Johnny and the professor had both said their piece, silence fell. There was no sound in the room but the crackling of the fire. Then Grandma stirred restlessly in her seat. She gave Grandpa a hard nudge in the ribs with her elbow and said to him in an accusing tone, "How about that, eh, Mr. Smarty Pants? Mr. Know-It-All, you're the one who said the ghost was just a lot of foo-fra, and I was just an old superstitious Irish lady. What do you say now, eh?" Grandpa groaned. "I think I'm going to be hearing about this for the next 6 months," he said, and gave Johnny a humorous look as if to say, "What are you going to do?" Grandma turned to the professor next. She gave him her best glower, as if she felt everything that was happening was his fault. "Them spiders," she began, wrinkling up her nose in disgust. Was they something that came with that blue do-jigger in the black box?" The professor turned to Professor Coot and grinned. "You're on, Charlie," he said. "Help the lady." Professor Coot spoke up. He sounded very scholarly and precise. "In a manner of speaking, yes. They were a manifestation of the forces, the evil forces, that dwelt inside the Blue Figurine. Insects have often been associated with evil spirits. Beelzebub was one of the 7 devils, and his name means Lord of the Flies." What was that blue thing, anyway?" Grandpa asked. "Did old Bart make it, or was it a souvenir?" Once again, Professor Coot responded, "No, in spite of that label he put on it to confuse people, it was a genuine Ushashti, a tomb figurine. But it was not Egyptian. It came from Kush, which is an ancient kingdom far up the Nile beyond Egypt. The kings of Kush conquered Egypt in the 8th century BC, and they ruled there for a while. When they were driven out, they carried Egyptian customs back to Kush with them. Then, when they were back in their own little kingdom, the Kushites pretended that they were Egyptians. They followed Egyptian religious practices, wrote Egyptian hieroglyphics, and they made Ushashti. Of course, the workmanship of these Ushashti was rather crude." He turned to the professor and smiled patronizingly. "No doubt, Roderick," he added, "that is why you failed to see that the Ushashti was genuine. A genuine ancient object, I mean." The professor scowled. "Oh, don't be silly, Charlie," he would have snapped. "I wouldn't have known a genuine Egyptian Ushashti if it bit me on the rear. But like most scholars, I like to pretend that I know more than I really know. So I screwed up. Shut your trap and have more sherry." There was an awkward silence. Professor Coot blew his nose, and then he made a dash for the coffee table. He refilled his glass and hurried back to his seat. Grandpa still had some questions to ask. "Look, Rod," he said, pointing a long freckled finger at the professor. "If that blue doohickey was really ancient, where'd old Bart get his hands on it? Do you think the old guy, that woodcarver, gave it to him?" The professor stuck his hands in his pockets and shrugged. "I think that the woodcarver must have given the figurine to Father Bart. By the way, would you care to see it, or rather what's left of it?" Grandpa, Grandma, and Johnny all said, "Yeah," or "Sure," or "You're darn tootin'" together. The professor walked over to the armchair where Professor Coot was sitting. Down on the floor, hidden by the shadow of the armchair, lay a large black book. Stooping, the professor picked up the book and carried it out into the center of the room. Johnny, Grandma, and Grandpa all leaned forward eagerly to look as the professor flipped the heavy cover back. Inside the book lay the shattered, charred fragments of the blue figurine. "My gosh!" exclaimed Johnny. "Did you do that to it, Professor?" The professor shook his head. "Nope. I found the figurine like this when I got back from our trip. I think it must have happened when you scattered the ashes of our dear friend Father Bart. The ring got the same treatment. I took it out of my pocket when I paid our bill at the motel, and it looked like this." He reached into the pocket of his smoking jacket and took out a twisted wad of blackened metal. "The stone was gone," he added, as he showed the remains of the ring around. "It vaporized or exploded or something. I found little bits of fingernail parings and hair. I think that's what they were. They were clinging to the metal part of the ring, and I imagine they were under the stone. I burned them in the fireplace, which is the proper thing to do with such rubbish, I believe." "Yes," said Professor Coot, nodding. "I believe you did the right thing." He smiled prissily and added, You also ought to bury the remains of the Ushoshti and the ring. Bury the pieces under the roots of a yew tree in a cemetery by the light of a new moon. That is the method of disposing of cursed objects that is recommended by the great astronomer Regiomontanus. He says that... You mean Johannes Mueller of Königsberg, don't you? The professor said, interrupting. That's his real name, you know. Professor Coote gave his friend a dirty look. Yes, I know what his real name is, but it would be stuffy and pedantic to call him Johannes Mueller, wouldn't it? And we wouldn't want to be stuffy and pedantic, would we? Professor Coote had been looking for some way of getting even for the shut-your-trap remark. Now he sat back in his chair, satisfied. Johnny spoke up again at this point. There was still a lot about this business that seemed puzzling to him. How come old Father Bart wanted to kill me, he asked. Was it just because he was evil, or what? The professor studied the burning tobacco in the bowl of his pipe. I think, he said slowly, that it was going to be a case of a life for a life. Bart was dead, you see. He was an evil sorcerer, and he had made some mistake in the middle of his sorcerizing. What he did wrong, we'll never ever know. But it got him killed. His body was burnt to ashes, and it was burned up in the mountains by whom? The woodcarver? The powers of darkness? I don't suppose we'll ever know, but to continue, Bart was dead, but his spirit still hung around on the earth. He haunted St. Michael's Church, and he would have gone on haunting it, harmlessly, forever, I suppose. But you took the lid off the cauldron, Johnny. You disregarded a warning and took the figurine out of the church. A church is a sacred place. It can keep the powers of evil in check. But once you removed the figurine from the protection of the church, then, quite literally, all hell broke loose. And what did our old pal Bart want? He wanted to be alive again in the world. So he appeared to you as Mr. Beard, and gave you a ring. And the ring gave you power. Power against bullies like Eddie. But that was not its real purpose. No, the ring gave Bart power over you. It was part of his plan. With the ring on your finger, you were going to die at midnight in Dustin Park, and he was going to come back to the world of the living. In what form, I wonder? As young Johnny Dixon, as Father Bart, as Mr. Beard? God only knows. Johnny shuddered. He said I would die if I took the ring off my finger. That's why I kept it on. The professor grimaced. That was just a lot of threatening falderall, my boy. You could have taken the ring off whenever you wanted to. Actually, the situation was just the opposite of what the old devil said it was. You would die if you did keep the ring on your finger. So it was really very fortunate that the professor's voice trailed away. He suddenly became very gloomy and bit his lip. What's the matter, Professor? Johnny asked. The professor heaved a deep, despairing sigh. He walked to the fireplace and knocked his pipe out against one of the andrions. Oh, nothing, he said sadly. Nothing much. It just suddenly occurred to me that Dr. Melkonian probably saved your life. He took the ring off, as you know, when you were asleep in his office. If you still had the ring on when you went to Dustin Park at midnight, the old buzzard would have made short work of you. And of me, too, perhaps. And was I nice to Dr. Melkonian? Was I grateful? No, I chewed him out over the phone because he was wrong about what was wrong with you. Sometimes I think I'm really not a very nice person. Tears came to the professor's eyes. It looked as if he was going to break down and bawl right there in front of everybody. Johnny jumped to his feet. There were tears in his eyes, too. No, Professor, he exclaimed loudly. You're not a bad guy. Really, you're not. If you hadn't come up to rescue me, I'd be dead. You stood right up to the ghost. And you're a real brave guy. Honest, I mean it. Don't cry. Please don't. The professor blinked and sniffed. He took out a red cotton handkerchief and blew his nose loudly. You think I'm okay after all? He said, looking around uncertainly. And there we will pause.